We explained that Donald Trump's tariffs on China and its retaliation have upset financial markets and some fear could trigger an economic downturn, even a global recession. But look closer at the detail and you also see opportunity, and especially for Australia, the lucky country. The key is to look at America's biggest exports to China. You can see them here. These products will now be hit with tariffs of at least 125%. So back in 2023, US exports to China will give or take $150 billion US. The biggest export item, oilseeds and grains at $25 billion US. Think soybeans, canola and wheat. Oil and gas is big, that's $11 billion. And meat products, $5 billion. So is Australia actually a winner from this trade war? So let's bring in here our panel for today. Arnold George from the Export Council, Denis Voznesensky, agricultural economist with the Commonwealth Bank, and Zachary Whale from Grain Growers. Zachary, can I start with you? And you saw those numbers there come up. You can see oil seeds, you can see grains. Does that actually mean that Australia's grain growers, and in particular our canola growers, for example, are going to be big winners if China turns to Australia to replace American products?
Look, I think it's really hard to tell what the specific impact will be, but what I would say initially is the world still needs the same amount of stuff. So when a trade war like this happens, what realistically happens is different commodities end up going to different markets. So for us, for oilseeds, most of our oilseeds currently going to the EU, and so this might impact, which specific country buys how much. But the world still needs this stuff. So I think Australia is in a really good position to keep growing these commodities and keep exporting them. But what I suspect we'll see is slight changes into which countries take them.
OK, so Denis Voznesensky, do you see any flow of trade? Do you see Australia as a winner, a net loser out of these trade wars?
Well, look, in the short to medium term, I think we're likely to be winners. So, for example, the US exported around 4.6 million tonnes of sorghum to China in 2024. There's about 1.7 million tonnes of wheat, 1.3 million tonnes of corn, all things in theory that they can start getting from us. Now, of course, I know we don't grow much corn, but we do grow a lot of feed grains. And we do, like you mentioned, grow also canola. Now, in the short to medium term, yes, there could be more demand for our product. And since the trade war began, we've actually seen an uptick in prices for a fair few commodities, including feed grains, including beef as well. But the one longer term challenge that we have to look at is that ever since probably the 1940s, our whole industry, agricultural industry more broadly, has been orientated around a large export market overseas and around free trade. As we move around free trade and there's a lot more disruption, does it start limiting that potential export growth when we look, OK, what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years? So we've relied on free and open markets, on a large export program. That's where a lot of the growth as an industry has come from. If that starts getting curtailed, what type of longer term impact does that have? Possibly a negative one.
I'll tell you what, and Arnold George from the Export Council, given all of that, is now a time that Australia's exporters have got to be more aggressive in trying to fill some of these markets where Americans in particular might be priced out of them going into China?
Absolutely, Ross. There's a strong opportunity here for Australian exporters, not just to look at China, but to other parts of the world where they were traditionally, say Latin America, there's traditionally a good market for the US, but they're finding that the US is now an unreliable trade partner. So they are looking for alternative sources of supply. So absolutely, Australia can certainly tap into this market. There is a concern that the growth in the world economy is going to slow. However, as we've seen, China has visited recently some of the Southeast Asian countries, and certainly trying to assure them that there is a pathway forward in the context of new investments. So as those investments come into line, again, there's an opportunity there for Australia to take advantage of those opportunities. But those exporters will need a helping hand from the government in the context of cost. There are a lot of costs that's likely to materialise. Yeah,
because as we're saying here, if it's oil seeds, if it's wheat, if it's meat, then quite clearly the world is still going to eat regardless of the economic circumstances. So from that point of view, Australian exporters, or those that are capable of exporting, they potentially will find themselves in a better position, either one, through extra demand, or B, through extra prices.
Sorry, yeah, absolutely. Australia could comparatively find some competitive advantage in the context of any cost differential. But also there's a quality issue as well. So, and that's something that we've certainly been talking to exporters, is to highlight what makes Australia different from any other supplier. It will be competitive. Expect the Canadians also to push pretty hard. So it's important for us to position ourselves quite early in the process, yeah.
So, Zachary, well, just explain one thing to me here, because there might be demand, but as we know, you can't simply magically appear with a new crop of canola. I mean, it's going to take some time to get in, or if you're going to try and create more beef, that'll take more time. But in specifically the grain growers, how long would it take them to respond if there is a change in global demand?
It's a really good question. Growers love to have set rotations, so they like to pre-prepare what they grow years out, and they try to stick to that. And so when we see commodity prices really fluctuate, sometimes we see a small change in grower behaviour, but they would rather stick to their set plan. However, if you've got a boat and if you've got a port and if you can get the administrative arrangements across the line, you can divert cargoes while they're on the water, and we can send these commodities anywhere in the world, providing there's a port to receive them. So to that end, what we really need is government remaining focused on supporting industry and working alongside industry, so that there is as many open doors as possible. So if one door shut, another open. So for instance, a few years ago, Australia was locked out of the Chinese market for our barley, and we were able to divert our barley to markets like Saudi Arabia and even some premium barley into countries like Mexico. So that only happened because industry had worked hard with the Australian government to make sure those opportunities were there. So, there's a program called the Agricultural Counsellor Program that puts agricultural specialists in high commissions and embassies in our key trading partners around the world, so that they can help resolve trade issues, help work through the paperwork, and if we need to actually start to put commodities into new and emerging markets, we're able to do that seamlessly.
So Zachary, while I've got you there, does it also mean that Australia's got to be very careful, in particular with its relationship with China in this tariff war? Because quite clearly, we might be able to fill some gaps that China might have with food and with grains, soy even. But the reality is, given our geopolitical associations with the United States, we've got to tread fairly carefully to make certain that those doors remain open.
Absolutely. I don't need to remind barley growers what it was like to be locked out of that market, red wine. There's a range of commodities that have been impacted in the last couple of years. I think this goes to Dennis's earlier point around the long-term impacts of a trade war. So historically, the World Trade Organization has helped uphold a set of rules and has let countries work through trade disputes and negotiations. And for a middle power like Australia, that WTO process has been really beneficial. We used it with barley and it helped resolve that trade dispute. If big players like the United States play by their own rules and run it alone on these things, and if other big markets follow suit, that will make the World Trade Organization far less capable for helping countries negotiate complex disputes. Now, for a country like Australia that exports so much, that's likely to have a negative impact. Who's the umpire? Where's the rule book? How do we work through these really complicated issues? That's something that we've got to be absolutely focused on because it's really important for countries like Australia.
So, Dennis Molison-Dzezinski, just come back to Australia, because quite clearly, with 10% tariffs from the United States, the one that everybody looks at is beef exports. Now, a lot of people, you and I have talked about this before, regardless of that 10% tariff, Americans still need Australian beef. And so they're the ones who will ultimately pay the higher prices. It simply still means that they need the beef because they can't produce enough of their own. So it goes in regards to all this trade that Australia is in quite a unique position because of its net exports of food.
That's right. So if we look at the beef situation, the US has a cattle herd that is at a multi-year, probably multi-decade low. And more importantly, that their consumer demand has been, up to recently, incredibly strong. So from a perspective of who bears the burden for the time being, it looks like US importers are going to be bearing at least part of the burden for importing that beef and paying for that tariff. Moving forward, though, the important thing to watch is the indirect impact, not the direct one. So the US, due to all these policies, policies, due to all these tariffs, due to uncertainty, is causing consumer confidence to decline quite sharply. And if you look at the Michigan University Consumer Sentiment Index in America, you have a 30% decline since the start of the year. So if you're a consumer in America, you're feeling a lot less certain about the future. And what do when you feel less certain? You start saving up maybe a little bit more, you stop spending as much, maybe you trade down in terms of quality of goods. And that eventually could lead to a bit of a depreciation in terms of demand, or a decline in demand. So that's something a bit indirect that I'm watching, but from a direct perspective, there's not much cattle in the US and demand has been strong. And if you look at, for example, Canadian exports to the US for beef, they're down 26% this year, partially just due to a multi-year drawdown on their herd as well. So from a demand point of view for our beef, it's still looking strong despite the tariffs, but I really would keep an eye out on the economic impact of all of these tariffs and trade wars.
Yeah, there's no doubt, because you've got to ask the question, if they're not going to get the beef from Australia, where are they going to get the beef from? Arnold, George, just one thing we can't ignore in all of this conversation, and that is Australia right now has got a very low historical Australian dollar. That only adds to the story of Australian exporters that we actually are in a very beneficial position because of that cheap Australian dollar. We know that Donald Trump has got a policy of trying to bring down the US currency. It hasn't worked, certainly against the Australian dollar at least. And so again, this is one of the reasons why, your members, Australian exporters, are probably in a pretty prime position to fill any gaps that emerge in the global markets.
Well, Ross, I think the dollar will be fluctuating quite a bit in the near term. As one of our colleagues had just mentioned there, is that if the U.S. economy declines, then potentially the value of the U.S. dollar is likely to go down. So in that context, the Australian dollar will actually go up, and that makes it much more expensive. So look, the key thing here for Australian exporters is really to diversify. The U.S. market only represents 5% of Australia's exports. So certainly compared to China, which represents more than 30%. So absolutely, that's where our economic weight of our interest should be. In that context, I think absolutely take advantage of when the Australian dollar is low, and look at working closely with their buyers and importers to maybe consider surge exports when the time is right.
So it's going to be fascinating to watch this. Zachary, well, I want to come back to you on this because, you can't ignore the fact that Australia right now is negotiating again with Europe, the European Union, to open up free trade agreements there. Now, they were stalled on a whole range of things, including beef in the past. So if, say, for example, the European market were to open up, just again, go back to that issue as to how quickly grain growers in particular could respond, because the opportunity is there. The question is whether Australia can grow enough to actually fulfill that demand.
The EU is an interesting one for the grain sector. We've currently got relatively good access for our oil seeds, and that's historically been one of our biggest markets, feeding into things like the European Union's biodiesel requirements. So that we've already got good access, and the EU does produce a lot of cereals, so we historically don't put much stuff in there. Look, I think these agreements take so long. I think Australian producers will have time to adjust to the opportunities if that agreement eventuates. I think the message would be, though, we need those agreements to continue, not just with the EU, but with a whole range of markets, because that is going to be where the opportunities lie. If this volatility increases, we'll end up falling back to these free trade agreements that we have with so many important trading partners, and they provide us a lot of certainty and stability, which gives our producers confidence.
Great stuff. So, Dennis Bosnazensky, sum it up for me. Australia, a winner or loser out of these tariff battles?
I would say for the time being, it looks like we're winners. There is, of course, challenges with the tariffs longer term. So right now, there is definitely a shortage or a limitation on how much beef the US can get inside of North America. But in the future, once they rebalance that, and if we haven't reached a deal yet from a tariff perspective, that could become challenging. One interesting thing I just wanted to add to what Zach was saying, though, the European Union, how we could benefit could be, again, slightly indirect. So if Europe goes ahead with tariffs on the US, well, they've actually recently been importing soy meal and soybeans from a feed perspective inside of Europe. So from a dairy perspective, cattle perspective, and if they put tariffs on US goods, that may mean they could need a little bit more canola than usual, maybe a little bit more feed grains. So that's something interesting to watch as well. There's a lot of indirect factors that are just popping up here and there that you didn't really quite expect in the beginning.
Well, I've got to tell you, it's been a fantastic panel. And again, it's fascinating to see that Australia could be net winners, at least in the short term, from all this. To Arnold George from the Export Council, to Dennis Vosnozensky from the Commonwealth Bank, and Zachary Whale from Grain Growers, many thanks for your time today.